In the cities, you had a lot of homelessness. Shanty towns, which are also known as Hoovervilles, began to pop up. Shanty towns or Hoovervilles were basically, once you were homeless, any kind of structure you could make out of anything you could find, newspapers, cardboard, stray metal, stray wood, that you could build a home with. Those were Hoovervilles. Soup kitchens and bread lines popped up so people could actually eat. Fun fact, and this one actually is a fun fact, the very first soup kitchen that was ever developed was actually built by Al Capone in Chicago. Al Capone, not the city of Chicago, not the United States government, not any other state, not any local government at all. Al Capone took a vested interest in providing food to the people of Chicago. So he created the first soup kitchen. Not even a charity did that first. African Americans and Latinos in the United States had a significantly higher unemployment rate and during the Depression, and they also had significantly lower wages. The African American unemployment rate was actually thought to be close to 50% during the Depression, compared to the average unemployment rate was 25%. So here's some pictures for you. You can see some of the bread lines and lines for soup kitchens, people trying to eat. That's exactly what those pictures are, lines of people waiting in line to be able to just get one meal. And sometimes those soups, to make them go further, you just add a little bit more water in it. So some of them were definitely lacking nutrition by the time people got to them. In the rural areas, so out in the country, you had people losing their farms. And then the farmers, when they lost their farms, they would become tenant farmers or migrant workers. These migrant workers were known as Okies. So they would farm where they could. They lost their farms, but if somebody else still had one, they would go live there, work, and try to make any kind of living that they could, or they had to leave. The Dust Bowl was also noted during the 1930s, during the Depression, which made things so much worse. So this took place in the Great Plains region of the country. I have a map on another coming up for you guys to see it. A lot contributed to the creation of the Dust Bowl. So you had these strong winds coming from south from Canada, came in, and it swept away the topsoil, which was already really weak because of years of over farming and people not cycling out their crops on the farms made the topsoil really weak. It lost its nutrients. And when you dig up the prairie grass also to help to build farms, it also weakens the soil. So as a result, these strong winds coming in just picked up dust and sand and spread it across the country in large swaths and buried things. So you can see here, wow, this image does not look as good on the PDF than it did on the PowerPoint, so it's kind of distorted here. As you can see, this egg-looking mass here is where the Dust Bowl was at. The yellow spot in the middle, or in Oklahoma, Kansas, Colorado, New Mexico, and Texas was actually that part of the country that got hit worst by the Dust Bowl. So much dust and sand was kicked up by these windstorms that there was actually dust from Kansas falling at the Statue of Liberty. And that's not an over-exaggeration. Dust storms were so massive that this dust was getting kicked so far up into the atmosphere that it was falling on the Atlantic coast. So causes of the Dust Bowl were drought, over-farming, and the loss of these prairie grasses. 60% of the people living in this Dust Bowl area, which I'll show back here real quick, 60% of the people living in this area left and moved further west. They moved out to California specifically. And these migrants, because a lot of them came from Oklahoma, became known as Okies. So if you've ever had to read the Grapes of Wrath or Of Mice and Men, that's from the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression, and they're Okies. And they're trying to fleeing the effects of the Dust Bowl, which they were already struggling anyways because of the Depression, and trying to go find work out west. All right, so here you can see a video of the after effects of some of these dust storms that would spring up during the Dust Bowl. So you can see even like farm equipment being completely buried under all this dust. Right, President Hoover's actions during the Depression were kind of lacking. Many of the economists in the country believed that the economy would naturally improve on its own, so he didn't really need to do anything about it. The businesses would start improving again because the nature of the economy is to have dips and highs. So they said just leave it alone, a little bit of laissez-faire. Hoover also did not believe in federal direct relief. He believed in what he called rugged individualism, that Americans just needed to pick themselves up by the bootstraps and get working. So he's kind of in that social Darwinism kind of idea here. If you want to succeed, you need to get out there and do it yourself. It's not the government's job to provide for you. He also specified that he believed that any sort of welfare program to help out individuals could potentially damage the moral fiber of the country by making people dependent on the government for a handout, so to speak. He also believed that industries and laborers needed to work out their problems on their own and to solve the economic problems. The economic problems that the country was facing was due to business issues and issues with labor. And if they worked that out, some of the economy would begin to grow again. And going along with the rugged individualism, he felt that it was charity's responsibility to help the poor, that if people felt that the poor needed to be helped out, then it was up to charities to do that. So some of the things that Herbert Hoover could have done in retrospect, looking back, that would have helped the economy during the Depression is that he could have increased the money supply in circulation to fight deflation. If more money in circulation, you're going to start creating inflation, which would have helped the economy quite a bit. He also could have vetoed the Smoot-Hawley tariff. That tariff did really trash world trade, but he didn't. Instead, he signed it and made it law. He could have gone off the gold standard, which Europe had done, and we'll get into what the impact of going off the gold standard was whenever we actually get to FDR and his actions. And also, he could have not raised taxes at this time. He was raising taxes to help for various reasons, but if he didn't raise taxes, it could have helped substantially for these people, especially at the beginning of the Depression. Some of the things Herbert Hoover did do, though, he got through Congress the Agricultural Marketing Act, and that helped stabilize demand for farm goods. So farm goods, there was more increase in demand for farm goods, so there was more pay coming out, or at least that was the goal of it. He got through the Federal Home Loan Banking Act, which lowered mortgage rates. The big thing is that because the mortgage rates were lowered and this Federal Home Loan Bank Act allowed farmers to refinance loans at this lower interest rate, so they were able to save their farms in some instances, but also to be able to get banks to start ensuring that they were getting money back in, coming in through farmers being able to pay off their loans. The biggest one, though, was the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which is the RFC, and it provided emergency financing to businesses. So businesses themselves would be getting assistance from the federal government. And the goal here, or at least the hope, was that if the businesses were helped out, that in effect they would start helping their workers out by increasing their wages. And in effect, this assistance would trickle down to the poor. So this is pretty much your first attempt at trickle-down economics in the country. However, all of these, especially the RFC, were programs that provided too little assistance, and they were way too late to have any substantial impact, especially to save Hoover's presidency. What really put the nail in the coffin of the Hoover presidency was the bonus army and the events surrounding the bonus army. The previously World War I veterans had been promised a cash payment, a cash bonus, and payments of life insurance that would start kicking in 1945. However, the Patman Bill was promoted in Congress, and this bill would actually up the time period that cash payment and that life insurance, decrease the time period that these World War I veterans would have to wait for that cash payment and that life insurance. It would actually make it pay out immediately because of the effects of the Depression. This was to help out those World War I veterans that were struggling. So the World War I veterans formed what was called the Bonus Army, and they went to Washington, D.C. to show their support for the Patman Bill, and they set up a Hooverville right across the street from the White House in an open field. They were only there just to show their support for the Patman Bill. However, the Patman Bill failed. When the Patman Bill failed, Hoover told all of the bonus marchers, that they needed to return home. Most of them did. About 2,000 members of the bonus army stayed to really kind of push through the need for this Patman Bill to be passed. And Hoover told them, again, they needed to go home, and then proceeded to call them a bunch of communists and send in the army. The army was led by General Douglas MacArthur, and his second in command was General Dwight Eisenhower, and they were sent in to run them off. The army that was sent in, they gassed the bonus army, so not tear gassed them, and then began burning down the shanties. This pictures for this were not posted, wrong time period. Were put in newspapers and everything all around the country, so everybody saw images of these World War I veterans who'd fought for the country. Some of them were injured and had been disabled because of it. Seeing that what all of their possessions, what was left of them after the impact of the Depression, all of them burnt down and run off on the orders of the president and run off by the military. So this really did not look good for Hoover, especially when it came out that some of these people were injured and also that a baby was killed in this in the attempt to run off the bonus army. This was such a negative had such a negative impact on Hoover's popularity that FDR made a comment that he didn't even need to campaign anymore for presidency, because this occurred in that summer of 1932, which was the election year, that Hoover just won the election for him simply by doing this.